they didn't want to. They didn't bother. So at the same time there was a massive industrialization process going on in the Soviet Union, and more people moving to the industrial towns. There was no food for them. The crisis took the leadership completely unawares. The policy bureaucrats, the Politburo voted unanimously for emergency measures. Thousands of young town dwellers were mobilized and sent out into the countryside as requisitioning squads. These young communists recruited from the locals who took them around the village, poking sticks in cellars and ripping into hidden sacks to find and claim the grain which the party believed was being hoarded. They would be the ones who would be following Russell Brand around today. This is what these maggots would be like in a socialist system, doing it, going around harassing people or not bothering anyone because they're not for the socialism. Okay. Stalin had come up with a new piece of socialist theory. You see, they have to come up with new socialist theory because the stuff doesn't bleed and work to begin with. A new piece of socialist theory to back up the attack on the villages. He argued that the closer a country approached towards achievement of socialism, the sharper the class struggle would become. This theoretical intensification of the class struggle was accompanied by his practical guide to help the communists identify a class enemy when they saw one. Peasants were divided into three grades. Now remember this, the Soviet Union, socialism is not supposed to be about the class system. We all know it is. And here was Stalin immediately dividing it into three grades, peasants in the country side. They were divided into poor, middle and kulak. The poor peasants owned nothing and worked on other people's lands for wages, which according to party theory ought to make them allies of the working class and the party. Middle peasants owned and produced enough for their needs, but no peasants owned and produced enough for their needs. No more. Kulak, the Russian word for fist, was used in pre-revolutionary times to describe a village moneylender, meaning they were holding on to their money really, really tight. Now the term was intended to cover peasants who had more than they needed and exploited others. The categories were neat, but they were absolute nonsense. No proper official economic classification of how to identify a kulak was ever agreed. There were lots of discussion documents arguing whether a kulak was someone who owned 2 cows or 3, whether a person who would let a room in their house was a kulak, how many days a year a farmer could hire a labourer before he became a kulak. There was even a category called ideological kulaks, which covered anyone who expressed sympathy for their fate. It is hard to escape. That means, like, if you felt sorry for someone who had worked hard all their life and built up a big farm, and you were a nice guy, and you said, it's not right the young communists are taking their land off them, you were then declared an ideological kulak. It's hard to escape the conclusion that a kulak was anyone the government chose to name as a class enemy. Andrei Cherenenkov, now 87 and still living in his Don Cossack village of Starocherezsk, was a fisherman from a poor peasant family. He remembers joining in a reconnaissance band. We went around to the next village taking grain. When I got home that night, my mother was in tears. "Where have you been?" she said. "While you were out, they came here and took all our own grain. They took all our own grain, and now we have nothing." So while he was out to the young communists taking someone else's grain, other young communists were at his mother's house stealing their food. That's wonderful, huh? The peasants did resist. And it didn't affect the rich because Stalin, when he came into power, he ordered 7 Rolls Royces for himself. Do you know that? Yeah, 7 Rolls Royces he ordered for himself. Look it up. The peasants did resist. They were looting, civil disorder and riots. Hundreds of party officials and procurement agents were assassinated. Peasants buried their grain in haystacks, good for them, or in churches, or sold it illegally to smugglers, or burned it, or threw it into the river. Those who could not or would not meet the demands were dispossessed of their land and deprived the right to vote. So they took the vote away from you because you didn't hand over your hard work to the government. The next year, 1929, even less grain was collected in spite of the increasingly harsh measures. Doesn't work. And the requisition of meat began. Rationing was introduced in the towns. The party made it clear that they were to put the blame in the new customary military image. They said that the rural sector had opened a second front against the state, being engaged in a livestock offensive as well as the grain offensive. Wasyl Hydarkov, a Ukrainian now living in the USA, remembers the atmosphere of that summer of 1929 in his village. We all felt it. It hadn't been an announcement. We just knew something was going on. Not interesting that, like, don't announce anything, but they knew something nasty was going to come down the drain. Down the road. That's the Danzig effect I spoke about. I've written an article on my page about that. The psychological turbulence in the collective conscious, that you know something bad is coming. The press began to talk of mass collectivization. The activists who had spent all the autumn of 1929 failing to procure enough grain were told to stay put and turn their attention to collectivization. 1,000 more party members set out to join them. They were fervent people who believed that they were fighting a war to liberate Soviet power from the stranglehold of an enemy class. The peasants understood very well what their goal was. It was to recognize everyone out of the land holdings that had won the revolution, dispose them and get them into collective farms. The EU Common Agricultural Policy, more or less, into collective farms, and the grain would be easier then to steal by the state. So it was unthinkable that the peasants would give up their independence voluntarily. Nikolai Bukharin, Stalin's major theoretical opponent, forecasted, "We will have to drown the risings in blood." On 27th of December, Stalin raised the stakes again. He declared that the aim of the liquidation of all kulaks, we must smash the kulaks, eliminate them as a class. We must strike the kulaks so hard that they will never rise to their feet again. A massive distribution of wealth and all resources in the socialist ideology. God, I hate Russell Brand. Well, I don't hate him, but he's just a fool. He had just turned 50 years old, and his birthday greetings in the party press had hailed him as the greatest Marxist-Leninist that ever lived. A secret police report of February 1930 from the Smolensk area gives a matter-of-fact account of how low Stalin's directive on the decolonization was put into practice by the Workers' Brigade and low-level officials of the party and the Soviets. Their slogan was, "Drink, eat, it's all ours." If they found any food, they ate it on the spot. Drink went the same way. They took their shoes off children's feet, warm underwear straight off their bodies of their parents. The same secret police report quoted one young communist who was appalled by the scenes. We are no longer people," she said. "We are animals." Another said, "The best and the hardest workers of the land are being taken away, with the misfits and the lazybones staying behind." One man came home to find all of his property removed except for a kettle, a saucer and a spoon. "Socialist, egalitarian, massive redistribution of wealth." He was arrested and sent to a deadly lumber camp for the far north of the forests. Another old man took a photo of the home as he left it. He was arrested and shot the same evening. The Politburo planned for the decolonization of 5 and 6 million people, and many local party committees enthusiastically over-fulfilled their plan. Stalin later remarked to Churchill that decolonization had been a matter of 10 million people. Whole villages were picked up, put on cattle trains, and dumped in the middle of the Arctic North. The secret police were in charge of the transport them. They called their cargo white coal. You see, that's what happens in these socialist systems. You're just reduced to a commodity, a human resource. Many of the victims never made their destinations. Those who did became the backbone of the Stalinist economy. Millions ended up in slave labour camps, building huge civil engineering projects like the canals, lumbering in the far north, or flung into the far eastern wilderness to open up the mineral riches of Stalin's Siberian frontiers. The novelist Ila Ehrenberg wrote, "Not one of them was guilty of anything, but they belonged to a class which was guilty of everything. Those left behind entered a maelstrom of suffering and resistance. In a typical case, a Ukrainian woman tossed a burning sheaf onto a thatched roof of her house. We worked all our lives for this house. You won't have it," she told the secret policemen. "The flames will have it." Massive distribution of wealth. Wild rumours circulated that women were to become communal property, that children would all be sent away to China, the old people would be born in a special machine to stop them eating. Oh, that's the Fabians for you. "So, madam, you must come before a committee and justify your existence." This was George Bernard Shaw and H.G. Wells. This is why they supported Stalin. The Antichrist was coming. The end of the world was nigh. During the spring of 1930, 14 million cows and a third of all the pigs in the Soviet Union were slaughtered by their owners in a mass refusal to donate a free grip to the collectives. The party claimed that half of all households had been collectivized that spring, but the countryside was in chaos. Nothing was being sown. On the 2nd of March 1930, Stalin wrote in an article for Pravda in which he accused the local officials of proceeding too fast, of being dizzy with success, even though he told them to do it and made them do it. Half of all they were stealing for themselves. Half of all new collectives collapsed and the peasants got back to work. But as soon as the harvest was safely gathered in, the campaign began anew. There was no escape. The immediate results of forced collectivization were nothing short of disastrous. Productivity tumbled while state demands rose sharply. In the Ukraine, local communists warned Moscow that this would result in starvation, but there was a saying at the time, Moscow does not believe in tears. Moscow does not believe in tears. One young communist reported from you're just robot. You're just a robot to them. One young communist reported from the village near Kharkov that he could make the meat deliveries, but only with human corpses. This shows up over and over again. This happened in Germany towards the end as well, where human beings became meat. There were decent officials who gave food to the starving, but this was described in a party report as a waste of bread and fish. Those who survived tell stories of unimaginable horror. Mothers killed and ate their children. This happened in Berlin in 1945 as well. Human flesh was sold at the market, again 1945. The dying dragged themselves to the lips of pits, dug for mass graves and lay there waiting for the end. People ate mice, ants, earthworms, bark. They dug up dead horses. They ground bones and leather into a kind of flour. Starving people appeared illegally in the towns and lay about the streets begging for help. In Kiev, Kharkov, Dnipropetrovsk, and Odessa, the local authorities sent carts out every day to collect the bodies. Park life! Now you remember that. You remember what I've just read to you. When you hear Russell Brand and his billionaire goldsmith girlfriend, Jemina Cam, talking about how they're going to, we need a massive redistribution of resources, and all these monkeys, all these morons following down the street. There's our Russ. He's our God. He's going to say, where's my anonymous mask? It's a sign of my individuality. Walking down the street, following this prancing doofus down the street. He's going to save us all with socialism down the street. And you read about what that has done in the past. When you take socialism to its natural, its theoretical and philosophical extreme, you get National Socialism and you get Bolshevik socialism, and you get nothing else, because the system does not fail, because it's not self-sustaining, so it cannot fail. So the failure of socialism is not measured in adaptations or amendments or improvisation by these monkey bureaucrats, and most of them, these bean counters. No, it's quantified and alterated and adapted by making the people change. So if you have a bunch of monkey bean counter socialist bureaucrats who are going, well, we have this much this year and that much that year, and then, for all kinds of factors from environmental to social, these numbers don't work out. Well, the bureaucrats are never wrong. Oh God, they're never wrong, and they don't make mistakes. In the socialist system, the ones at the very bottom who don't have any say are the ones who have to make the adaptation, even to the point where they have to eat their own children and ground leather and dried bones down to make flour. Park life. Now you remember that. Now I'm not saying the current capitalist system, which isn't even capitalism, it's corporatism, is the way forward or it's the right thing. I'm an old-fashioned mercantile capitalist. Make things, produce things, sell them, sell ideas, sell concepts, produce things, create things, make all this kind of stuff. And this is what they don't like. They don't like this. You see, when you think about it, if you reduce capitalism down to the basic form, it's almost very close to a form of anarchy, because it doesn't necessarily have to involve cash. It can involve barter, okay? But when you strip socialism down to its basic form, it's binary code, zeros and ones, and there's no flexibility in there. And when I hear these people getting romantic, look, I've never met a member of the Socialist Workers' Party who was a socialist worker. That group have been knocking around universities for 40 years, getting naive and upper middle class students to join and wave red flags with a hammer and sickle on them, and they're going, I'm Shortley Smedlington of the Cambridge Socialist Workers, and I'm here today to address, I'm here today to promote women's rights and anything against misogyny. And I'm a socialist for that reason, because I believe in these things, because, common people must be taught how to behave. Common people should not be allowed to think for themselves, and they certainly should not allow to be independent. And I wholeheartedly, in fact, while I was down at the Cambridge Cricket Club, drinking my Pimm's #1, I said to my good friend Basil, Shortley Smedlington here, he heartily approves of the Russell Brand Socialist Revolution, because we can finally teach these common people how to live so they don't cause us any problems. We can use cultural Marxism to modify their behaviour. Look, we are not born equal. Darwinism says so. That's why Prince William can go and, announce wildlife programs while he's shooting the bollocks off wild boar in Spain the next day. It doesn't apply to us. We are the Darwinian master race. And that's what I'm Shortley Smedlington. I have ears like an elephant's testicles. I have buck teeth. And if you were to take me out of this environment, there will be no difference between me and the banjo player from Deliverance. But I'm Shortley Smedlington of the Cambridge Socialist Workers' Party, and me and my buck teeth are here to save the working class and the farmers from themselves. And that's really what these bastards are like. This is really, really what they are like. That's how they think. That's how they carry on. And that's why you would never meet working class people who join these hardcore socialist groups. You will only find the silver spoon types. You won't find anyone else. Because any working class person you'll never find a farming person, ever. Because they can see through that crap right away. It's clear as anything. That, you're not going to, just from the fact that they understand that the countryside it's a victim of the fortune of the environment, that you cannot quantify a production or a theoretical model of production on the countryside. You just can't. And the EU is going so full on with this. Let me tell you something that happened this week. In Ireland, the predominant fuel that people use outside the cities is a thing we call turf, peat. It's wonderful fuel. It burns slowly. It burns all night long. It's one of the best industries this country ever created. It generates massive amounts of electricity. But what people always say is that when you come into the Irish countryside, there's a beautiful smell of turf burning, peat burning. It smells like incense, and absolutely it does. It's a beautiful smell. Well, I was looking at an Irish political group this week, and you had like the Irish version of Shorty Smelting. Facna nu Funacon, from Dorky, Facna nu Funacon from Dorky of the Environmentalist Socialist Alliance of South Dublin. He was outraged driving across Ireland this week because of the disgusting acrid smell of smoke from turf fires and the impact they have on our carbon emissions. And they've already begun successfully to brainwash a new generation of young Irish people to think that turf fires are acrid, poisonous smoke, when it's hearth and home. Our ancestors have burned turf going right back to the Neolithic ages, the Paleolithic ages. The people who built Stonehenge and Tara sat around turf fires. That fragrant smell of turf has been a continuum probably 10,000 years, 10,000 years in this country, up to the present, when the cultural Marxists of the EU have decided that our peat bogs and our turf industry and our local farmers who go out during the summer's month and they cut the turf. That's what the Irish expression, how is she cutting, comes from. That means how is the turf cutting? Where it's a social thing where entire families go out in the bogs and they cut turf and they have picnics on the bog in this beautiful natural environment, and they gather up their fuel for the winter. The EU cultural Marxists have decided that that's poisonous, acrid smoke. And it's causing polar bears to get their arses wet. Don't get upset about it, okay? Just keep cutting turf. Ignore them. Ignore them. Don't go, I have to do this because the government says it, or the EU says it, or the US State Department says it, or the Canadian State, whatever group says. Ignore it, okay? You do not have to acquiesce. You can ignore them. 90% of this is calling your bluff. 90% of the bills and the taxes and everything else you pay is calling your bluff. We'll arrest you if you don't do it. Technically, in many cases, they can't. It's a bluff. They used to have like TV ads in Ireland for the TV license, and one of them showed the TV license inspector, like a policeman, a Polish guy no less, inside the room of the house saying, "Where's TV license?" And this is like nonsense, because if you live in Ireland and a TV license inspector enters your house, you are perfectly legally within your rights under recent laws, and it won't affect you, to feckin' kill him, okay? Because that's technically a break-in and entering. They're not, but this is what they do. They start off by showing TV license ads, showing the TV license man outside your house in his car with his detector band, which doesn't work, by the way. That's just a piece of metal spinning around the roof. Inside that is some guy, with a copy of Playboy magazine. That's why the band is shaking, and he's probably spinning the thing at the top. And that detector band, "Oh, we know you have a TV." Those things never existed. They didn't work. They just drove around the neighbourhood. Some alcoholic driving around with them, got a job from the union. That's all that was. And they can't come into your house, but the ads changed. And now the ads for TV license, now they show the TV license inspector inside the home, as now he has entry. He has these statutes that allow him to enter the home. And we've got a great story for the final 30 minutes that will blow your mind, to do with David Bowie and the occult. And we're going to play the final song, which is Where the Wild Roses Grow by Nick Cave and Kylie Minogue. See you in the final half hour. And welcome back to the final stretch of the Velocity of Now, the first show of 2015, and it's been a blast so far. And we've still got 30 minutes or so to go. Well, actually about 25. And I've got something really good for you that I came across during the week I had no idea about. When you hear about drugs, drugs open up portals to other dimensions, and that things come in. And then they always say, oh, it's, mushrooms or ayahuasca. And you have that's kind of like the Peruvian jungle juice thing that's all a fad today. That you take a load of ayahuasca and you'll get answers, you get beings. Well, all these drugs do that, even alcohol. There was an Irish saint called Matt Talbot. When I was a kid, I was growing up, I was walking down this back alleyway somewhere in central Dublin, and there was a statue of the Virgin Mary kind of impregnated into a wall, and there was a little plaque saying, "This is where Matt Talbot saw the Virgin Mary," and then gave up the drink, and and he became, when you hear this one, for Catholic kinky, he saw, he was on the piss constantly, and he had the delirium tremors, and he saw this fictional being, probably a jinn or something, the Virgin Mary, and he converts to mad Christian Catholicism. He straps himself with chains for the rest of his life, S&M thing, for the rest of his life, and walks around with chains on his body. An absolute pervert, creep show. And because he's chained himself up all his life, he's made into a saint. Don't ask. But he saw those visions because he was on vast amounts of alcohol. Now, there's one drug. I don't care if you want to like inject yourself with Coleman's mustard. That's your own business, okay? But there's one drug that I find reprehensible, and that's cocaine. Cocaine is an utterly reprehensible drug. It turns people into absolute douchebags. I've known people who got into cocaine who were perfectly normal before it, and they became almost psychopaths. And sometimes get close to it, Protos. And cocaine is an appalling drug, but I used to believe that these are not. I used to have mates who went on the cocaine back in the music days, and I'd say he's not in there anymore. Where'd he go? Who is this piece of crap that's taking him off? Where'd he go? And I never knew about this, but I found this article that was posted on a blog from Paranoia magazine, and I had no idea. Now, I knew that David Bowie was a cokehead, a big nose candy head, and I knew Bowie was into kind of weird alien stuff. Like back in the late 60s, he used to take LSD and sit atop his flat in London holding a TV antenna, trying to talk to aliens, communicate with them. But it actually was a lot darker than that. And I want to read this article from Paranoia magazine, reproduced on this blog, or excerpted on this blog. And it's called Along Comes Mr. Scratch. And this blew my mind when I read it the other day. Like many rockers before and after, David had taken a liking to the good life. You know, the old adjectives, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Well, on top of this, add a heap of consciousness expansion and an interest in the occult, and you will have the prevalent influence of what might have been David Bowie's immortal being. But paranoia soon struck in the form of the old nemesis, nose candy, commonly known as cocaine. With the help of Bowie himself and some close associates at the time, Mark Spitz details in the just published Bowie biography how David was living in L.A. just a few houses away from the LaBianca estate, where Charles Manson's gang had terribly mutilated Sharon Tate and her friends in a ritualistic murder. Bowie had taken to doing blow regularly, and he was getting more and more desperate and paranoid with each passing day. In a number of shocking revelations, Mark Spitz, in the Bowie biography, explains precisely what was transpiring in the pop singer's troubled life. While planning the follow-up to Young Americans album, Bowie would sit in the house with a pile of high-quality cocaine on top of a glass coffee table, a sketch pad, and a stack of books. Psychic Self-Defense by Dion Fortune, actually a very good book, was his favourite. I actually have that book. That's bizarre. I have that book by Dion Fortune like 3 inches behind me. I didn't even know that. Was his favourite. Its author described the book as a safeguard for protecting yourself against paranormal malevolence. Using this and more arcane books on witchcraft, white magic, and its malevolent counterpart, black magic, as rough guides to his own rapidly fragmenting psyche, Bowie began drawing protective pentagrams on every surface. Bowie told the author, "I'd stay up for weeks. Even people like Keith Richards were floored by it, and there were pieces of me all over the floor. I paid with the worst manic depression of my life. My psyche went through the roof. It just fractured into pieces. I was hallucinating 24 hours a day." Spitz said, increasingly Bowie was convinced that there were witches in his semen. Witches after his semen. They were intent on using it to make a child sacrifice to the devil, essentially the plot to Roman Polanski's 1968 supernatural classic, Rosemary's Baby. Seeing that he was in desperate need, poet and songwriter Cherry Vanilla hooked Bowie up with Valley Elmlark, who Spitz described as a Manhattan-based intellectual who taught classes at the New York School of Occult Arts and Sciences, then located on 14th Street, just north of Greenwich Village, and which the author of this article was director of from the mid-1960s for more than a decade. promoting lectures and classes by the who's who of paranormal and UFO experts of the area, including Cleve Baxter, Stanley Krippner, Jim Molesley, John Keel, and of course Wally Elmlark, the White Witch of New York. As added confirmation of the madness of David was trying to cope with, ex-wife Angie Bowie reveals even more details of his fascination and dabbling into the occult in her own personal remembrance, backstage passes, life on the wild side of David Bowie. There was a beautiful Art Deco house on 6 acres, an exquisite site, property, and a terrific value at just $300,000. But he took one look at the detail I had noticed, a hexagram painted on the floor of a circular room by the previous owner, Gypsy Rose Lee. A great deal of coddling and reassurance got us through the crisis, and I went and found the Doherty Drive house. Built in the late 50s and early 60s, it was a white cube surrounding an indoor swimming pool. David liked the place, but I thought it was too small to meet our needs for very long, and I wasn't crazy about the pool. In my experience, indoor pools are always a problem. This one was no exception, albeit not in the usual ways. Its drawback was one I hadn't encountered before, and hadn't seen or heard of since. Satan lived in it. With his own eyes, David said, he had seen him, Satan, rising up out of the water one night. Feeling demonic forces moving in, David felt strongly that he needed an exorcism and asked that his newfound friend, White Witch Wally Elmlark, be called upon to lend her assistance to remove the evil from its surroundings. A Greek Orthodox church in LA would have done it for us. There was a priest available for such a service, the people had told me, but David wouldn't have it. No strangers allowed, he said. So there we stood, with just Wally's instructions and a few $100s worth of books, talismans, and assorted items from a Hollywood's comprehensive selection of fine occult emporia. There he, David Bowie, was then primed and ready. The proper books and doodads were arranged on a big old-fashioned lectern. The incantation began, and although I had no idea what was being said or what language it was being said in, I couldn't stop a weird cold feeling rising up in me as David droned on and on. There's no easy or elegant way to do this, so I'll just say it straight. At a certain point in the ritual, the pool began to bubble. It bubbled vigorously, perhaps trashed is a better term, in a manner inconsistent with any explanation involving air filters or the like. The rock and roll couple watched in amazement. Angie says she tried to be flippant. Well, dear, aren't you clever? It seems to be working. Something's making a move, don't you think? But I couldn't keep it in. It was very, very strange, even after my recent experiences having trouble accepting what my eyes were seeing. Angie insists that she would peek through the glass doors leading to the pool every so often and was dumbfounded by what she saw. On the bottom of the pool was a large shadow, or stain, which had not been there before the ritual began. It was in the shape of a beast of the underworld. It reminded me of those twisted, tormented gargoyles screaming silently from the spires of medieval cathedrals. It was ugly, shocking, malevolent, and frightened me. I backed away from it, feeling very strange. Went through the doorway and told David what I'd seen, trying to be nonchalant, but not doing very well. He turned white, but eventually became revived enough to spend the rest of the night doing coke, but he wouldn't go near the pool. I still don't know what to think of that night. It runs directly counter to my pragmatism and my everyday faith in the integrity of the normal world, and it confuses me greatly. What troubles me the most is that if you were to call Stain the mark Satan, I don't see how I could argue with you. David, of course, insisted that we move from the house as quickly as possible, and we did. But I heard from reliable sources, Michael Lippman for one, the property's real estate agent, that the subsequent tenants haven't been able to remove the shadow, even though the pool has been painted over a number of times. The shadow always comes back. Now, this got me thinking about a few things. firstly, as I've already spoken, that cocaine does open up, shall we say, other realities and other experiences to a phenomenon. But also the fact that Bowie was involved with these people that were very close to the Lubyanka and the Sharon Tate killings. And somehow, I think if Ed Upperman or Joshua is listening, it's very close to process kind of stuff. And I definitely think the Process Church at the Final Judgment, it sounds very typically in that kind of scene. Hollywood, Process were very West Coast, where, and they weren't very West Coast, actually very East Coast, but they were involved in Hollywood at that level. And you do wonder if there was something like that going on. On another level, what this also reminds me of is something I've wondered for a long time. Did Aleister Crowley create the Loch Ness Monster? We know he went down there to Boleskine Manor to perform the Abamelum, which is the, basically, if you say it, ritual was basically to open up the gates of hell. That's basically, in a very simplistic term. But it was a grueling 3-month ritual where, Crowley had to get up early in the morning, starve himself, and all these other kinds of things. And in Crowley's typical form, he left. And it wasn't long after he left that, now I know there's been reports of the Loch Ness Monster, it going back to the 9th century, but some saint. But that was just one thing and had never been mentioned since. And every single lake on these islands has a monster in it, even the one up the road from me, that's some saint banished. It's everywhere. But the worst thing to do in ritual magic is to leave a ritual half finished. And you do wonder if Aleister Crowley created the Loch Ness Monster by, not finishing the Abamelum ritual. And this disturbance in Loch Ness, isn't it funny how we've come back from Liberace singing Loch Lomond to this? Well, synchronicities are just flying tonight. What channel, Liberace? To this tonight, if there's something happened like this with Bowie, there was some kind of water tulpa was created. It also brings home the whole realization of how deeply connected the occult and Hollywood are. I mean, I look at sites like Vigilant Systems and I say, okay, they see Illuminati and all stuff everywhere. But at the very basic, that stuff is true. There is a tremendous, you just have to look at all these occult societies around showbiz. You look at, Laurel Canyon, and you look at all these other, you look at what happened to Graham Parsons, found ritually murdered out on Joshua Tree National Park, just outside Hollywood, and all these other kinds of things. Not the Tate murders, the murder of John Lennon, who Mark Chapman was, what he was involved in. You look at groups like, you look at the Process, how they were heavily involved in pop music in England in the 60s. They even gave Jimmy Savile a page or two in their sex issue. Jimmy Page. It just goes on and on. And did you hear about, Robert Johnson's, he made a deal with the devil at the crossroads for, for fame. You had Bob Dylan on 60 Minutes telling Ed Bradley that, he made a deal to be famous, and Ed Bradley said, with who? He said, the biggest, baddest man of them all. There is something inherently wicked about the music industry, and it seems to thrive on the murder of young people or the death of young people. The body count in pop music and in rock music is phenomenal. I mean, it'd be hard pressed. Like if you take the upper echelon of pop and rock music, particularly between the 60s, 70s, and 80s and 90s, if you were to apply that body count to any other industry, it would be off the scale. Become a pop star, die young. Become a rock star, die young. And the drug thing just doesn't account for it all the time, because All of us have gone through drug phases. Lots of people have gotten drugs and they don't die. But yet rock stars do. And it's continuous. The mortality rate is phenomenal. Is there a sacrificial element to this? I don't know. But if you look at the Lost Prophets and Ian Watson and that whole scene, that to me reeked of a cult. And yet none of the newspapers mentioned this. None of the newspapers spoke about this. But that whole Lost Prophets scene, the baby, the going for the children, younger and younger, is nearly always a cult. And the fact that Watson still has these thousands of people, mostly young women, who adore him and visit him in prison, would also suggest that, and even look at him, that it's almost like you have to involve yourself in these forces in order to have fame within the music industry. Also poignant and connected to the Watson thing is the fact that Peaches Geldof, after Watson was sent down, she tweeted on Twitter that the women who did this were just as guilty now, and they should be named. Was she telling us that these women involved in Watson and giving their babies to Watson, were they part of a cult that Watson was in? Because it wasn't long after that we suddenly hear she's involved in a Satan-worshipping death cult called the OTO, which is not. The OTO not satanic. That was just what the newspapers put upon it. And then the next thing, she's dead. So she blows the whistle potentially on a cult aspect to Watson and the baby raping thing. And then she's dead. There are certain things you don't want to know. It's just like the show I did on the old Type 1 version of this, where I was talking about Jimmy Savile and the 666 serial killings, and the show was literally attacked that night. And I've had some very strange emails, contacts ever since that show came out, because they want you to believe that Watson was a paedophile, but don't go any further. They want you to believe that Savile was a paedophile, but don't go any further. These people are involved in energy harvesting and child energy. I don't know. That's what they're after. I don't know what that's about. I don't want to know what it's about. But it's the same thing. Go no further. Kill the story off. Now, the numbers of people who followed my Jimmy Savile stuff and the numbers of hits that I've got on all the documents and the videos I've made, they're mainstream numbers, they're mainstream level. People are fascinated by this this Jimmy Savile thing. I think if there's one thing we need to do in this alternative research scene in terms of research into the occult, is to try and get specific details and see if we can see an emerging pattern. I feel a lot of the stuff like Illuminati Witch Queen and that Madonna song that came out this week, and this Illuminati this and a lot of that stuff is distractings. A lot of that stuff is to throw you off, and even the Crowley stuff, that's to throw you off as well. There's some other group, and there's just something tells me the Process Church is involved or part of this, and this continuum has continued on from the 1960s through the 70s, 80s, 90s, and is still with us. They've just gone underground. But there's too much of this stuff, like the Bowie story I read tonight, that skirts around it. Now, what's the process? The process are basically Satanists / neo-Nazis. Bowie went through a weird kind of breakdown in Berlin, where he became a kind of a Nazi. He was walking around, doing goose stepping and saying that he was walking around and he basically acting nuts, spouting all this Nazi stuff. He was even doing it on stage in the shows. At the same time, you had people like Eric Clapton, who was basically giving neo-Nazi addresses from the stage, saying that everyone should vote for Enoch Powell and clean this country out. this kind of thing. A guy who had built his career on taking black people's music, the blues, making him a millionaire because of it, then suddenly standing on stage saying we need to get Enoch Powell in power so we can take all these immigrants out, these West Indians out of the country. And there's something really bizarre going on. It's just there's a real like that tunnel, that Nazi tunnel in that story. There is still an unknown mystery to be cracked here. That's why people have to listen to the Ed Opperman report on Friday. It's on very late, but look at the podcast. Ed Opperman and his work that he's doing on, continuing the investigation into the Process Church and following on from the work of Maury Terry and the Son of Sam and all that stuff. These guys are onto something major, and it's, the people that I've introduced to it have said, "Wow, Thomas, this is incredible stuff. This is it. There's something to this." So, the next time you hear someone saying, "Oh, Illuminati," "Oh, he makes a sign of a triangle in the video," "Oh, he puts his hand over one eye," "Oh, he has 666," or Madonna's new song. People said Madonna's new song is making. Okay, good. Let's take this to the nth degree. Okay, people said that Madonna's new song about the Illuminati is making fun of the Illuminati and people who are into conspiracy. But if you read the lyrics, she's saying it's not this stuff. What she may be saying to us is, it's not that none of this stuff exists. It's probably saying to us, there's something else and you guys don't know about it yet. Think about that one. Well, it's 2015. Thanks for joining me for these 2 hours. I hope you enjoyed it very much as I did. I hope I've entertained you, given you food for thought, and sent you off onto an interesting and enjoyable 2015. Look, it doesn't matter what they throw at us this year. Do not lose your sense of humor. Do not lose your creativity. What goes on out there does not have to be reflected by you in your own life. Get out there, enjoy yourself, make the most of everything, and feck 'em if they can't take a joke.